The truck rattled like a dying beast as it crawled to a stop, dust curling into the orange evening light. Beyond the cracked windshield lay nothing but desert, flat, endless, and merciless. And in the middle of it, clinging stubbornly to life, stood a half-collapsed gas station with its faded sign swaying in the wind, Navarro Fuel and Service. Ethan and Eli Navarro sat quietly in the back seat, their hands folded in their laps. They had never seen the desert's emptiness, never watched the horizon burn in colors of rust and gold. Blind since birth, their world was measured in sound and touch. The creak of the station's old sign, the grit of sand blown against the car door, the loyal breath of the dog at their side. Atlas, the aging German shepherd, shifted closer, his head brushing Eli's shoulder as if to steady him. The boys had inherited all of this. The station, the silence, the dog. On the day their father's will was read, Colonel Gabriel Navarro had been many things. A soldier, a strategist, a man who spoke in orders more than in comfort. But to his sons, he had always been an unreachable figure, one who left more questions than answers. His death came as suddenly as his life had always felt distant. A mysterious explosion whispered about but never explained. In the lawyer's envelope, there had been a single page, written in their father's sharp, unyielding hand. "You won't need eyes to see the truth. Trust Atlas." Those words had clung to them like a riddle, cruel and comforting all at once. For two boys who had never seen a sunrise, what truth could there be left to discover? And why the dog? Why this forgotten place with its peeling paint and broken pumps? Ethan reached out, fingers brushing the rough hood of the truck, the warmth of metal fading into the desert chill. "It feels empty," he whispered. Eli tilted his head, listening. No, not empty. Waiting. Atlas let out a low whine, then stood tall, ears pricked toward the darkened station. To the twins, it was not the ruin of a life gone by. It was the echo of something unfinished. The air carried the weight of secrets, and in that weight was the first flicker of purpose. For the first time since the explosion that had stolen their father, Ethan and Eli felt something stir inside them. Not fear, not grief, but the undeniable sense that this broken station was not an ending at all. It was the beginning. The station smelled of rust, dust, and something older still, a silence that felt pressed into the very walls. The twins moved slowly through the ruins, their canes tapping against broken tiles, their palms brushing over surfaces that once belonged to another life. They couldn't see the peeling paint or the cobwebs stretched like thin threads across the corners, but they could feel the weight of abandonment, every detail written into the air. Ethan trailed his fingers along a cracked counter, pausing when they caught on a jagged edge. "It feels like a place that's been forgotten," he murmured. Eli bent down, touching the floor, feeling for patterns in the dust. "Or maybe," he answered softly, "it's a place that remembers." Atlas was restless. The dog circled the small living quarters with his tail stiff and ears sharp, sniffing with urgent purpose. He was not exploring, he was searching. The twins felt it too, the tension in his movements, the quiet command in the way he nudged them toward the back wall. Then came the sound, a sharp, hollow thud as Atlas struck his paw against plaster. Both boys froze. Ethan crouched low, placing his palm flat against the wall. It didn't feel solid. There was a faint vibration, a whisper beneath the surface. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked. Eli pressed his ear close. Even in blindness, his senses were sharp, tuned to every shift in sound. He tapped lightly with his knuckles, and the hollow echo confirmed what Atlas had already known. Their father's message, etched in memory, returned with a sting. "Trust Atlas." With trembling hands, Ethan traced the edges of the wall until he found a seam, faint but undeniable. Together, they worked, prying loose brittle plaster until the dust broke free in choking clouds. The air filled with grit, and their coughs echoed in the empty station, but beneath their fingertips something cold and metallic emerged. It was a hidden compartment. Inside, carefully placed as though waiting for them, lay three objects: a thin leather-bound journal, an old hard drive marked with military codes, and, most unexpected, a map embossed in Braille. Their hands hovered over it with reverence. The raised dots were worn but clear, a trail of coordinates pressed into heavy paper. Eli's fingers moved first, tracing the shapes slowly, his breath catching with each word. Ethan followed, their twin rhythms turning the silence into a shared discovery. The phrase that rose beneath their touch stopped them both. Orion Protocol. The room seemed to tighten around them, the weight of the words sinking deep. Ethan whispered them aloud, and the sound carried like a secret finally spoken. Their father's journal confirmed it. The pages were filled with notes etched in hard, disciplined strokes. The hand of a soldier who trusted precision over sentiment. Words spilled of shipments gone missing, contractors under false names, and whispers of a syndicate that thrived in the shadows. The boys could not see the ink, but they felt the urgency in every indentation, every groove pressed into paper by their father's steady hand. It was not the handwriting of a man who had given up. It was the writing of a man chasing something dangerous, something that might have cost him his life. Eli closed the journal carefully, his fingers trembling. "He wanted us to find this," he said. Ethan turned toward Atlas, who sat watching them, his amber eyes steady and unblinking. The dog gave a low rumble, not a growl but a sound of recognition, as if confirming that they had stepped onto the path their father had left behind. For two blind boys, truth had always felt like something just out of reach, locked away in a world they could not see. But now, with the hollow wall broken open and the secrets laid before them, truth had become something else entirely, something they could touch, and it terrified them. Because Orion Protocol was not just a phrase in Braille. It was a beginning, it was a promise, and it was a warning. The twins thought the hollow wall had given them the last of their father's secrets. But Atlas wasn't finished. The dog paced across the garage floor, nose pressed low, tail stiff as a compass needle locked to true north. Ethan and Eli followed, their canes tapping over the concrete until Atlas stopped at a patch of rusted steel half buried in grit. Ethan crouched, palms brushing over the metal surface. It was cold, jagged at the edges, with a faint groove that could only be a hatch. Eli reached into the small box of their father's effects, fingers closing around the heavy brass key they had almost forgotten. Together, the brothers slid it into the lock. For a breathless moment, it resisted, groaning like the station itself was reluctant to give up one more secret. Then, with a final twist, the hatch released. A rush of air escaped, stale and metallic. Beneath the hatch, an elevator yawned open, its steel cage coated in dust, its panel dim but alive with the faintest hum. Guided by Atlas, the twins stepped inside. They felt the vibration before they heard the groan of machinery, the floor trembling under their boots as the elevator sank into darkness. When the doors opened, the air was cooler, sharper. The twins stepped out onto concrete that echoed underfoot. Ethan swept his cane wide, striking the edge of something tall and humming. Servers, row after row of them. The bunker stretched around them like the skeleton of a forgotten war. Eli's hands found a desk cluttered with reels of tape, recording equipment, and, most haunting of all, a notebook filled with deep, carved handwriting. Their father's. Every page was cataloged, precise, ruthless in its detail. Even without sight, the twins could feel the force of his obsession pressed into the paper. And always, always the same words returned. Helios Syndicate. Ethan whispered the name, tasting it like poison on his tongue. Their father hadn't retired to die in peace. He hadn't drifted into quiet obscurity. He had been fighting, chasing something vast and dangerous until the very end. And the explosion that took him wasn't fate. It was execution. Atlas pressed close against their legs, steady and unshakable, as if reminding them of the promise they had been given. You won't need eyes to see the truth. Trust Atlas. In the silence of Outpost 7, the twins understood. Their inheritance was not a broken station. It was a war unfinished. Ethan and Eli had lived their whole lives without sight, but that didn't mean they were lost in darkness. They carried maps inside their minds, memories of sound, texture, and rhythm that made unfamiliar spaces feel like extensions of themselves. Where others saw blindness as a wall, the twins had learned to treat it as a language, one they spoke fluently. And now, in the aftermath of Outpost 7's revelations, that language became their weapon. Atlas was their compass, steady and precise. The dog walked ahead with purpose, every step measured, every turn a signal the twins could read without words. Ethan listened to the cadence of Atlas's nails tapping on the ground. Eli tuned into the shifts in the dog's breathing, and together they followed him into landscapes they had never seen, but somehow already understood. The Braille map had been more than coordinates. It was a trail of ghosts. Each location marked led them to places scarred by secrets. Test fields littered with twisted metal, bunkers where the smell of burned chemicals still clung to the earth, and silos long since emptied, but echoing with the memory of fire. Ethan crouched once, fingertips brushing through the ash-stained dirt. "It feels like the ground itself remembers," he said softly. At night, in the cracked rooms of the station, they tried to piece the fragments together. But the puzzle was larger than they could navigate alone. That was when Maya Torres appeared, a voice on the other end of an encrypted channel, a young hacker who had once worked with Colonel Navarro in Silence and Shadows. Her voice carried the same urgency their father's notes had. "You boys are chasing ghosts," she said the first night. "But they're real, and they're dangerous." Maya became their eyes in the digital world. She combed through the hard drives, decrypted files the twins could only imagine, and fed them truths like oxygen. Her presence shifted the rhythm of their nights. Ethan reading Braille by touch, Eli recording every detail in whispered notes, Maya's voice humming through the speakers, and Atlas resting near the door, sentinel against the dark. What the three of them uncovered was more than corruption, it was betrayal. The same names surfaced again and again in the data, buried beneath code names and false trails, but undeniable when pieced together. Spectre. The word itself carried a chill, a ghost stalking the edges of their father's life. Their father had been tracking him, closing in, pressing too close to a truth someone wanted buried. The explosion hadn't been fate. It had been murder. For the twins, the revelation struck like lightning. Ethan's fists clenched as he whispered, "He wasn't just taken from us. He was silenced." Eli felt his chest tighten, the ache of years without answers finally given a shape, and were meant to finish what he started. Atlas pressed against their knees then, his body warm, his breath steady. It was as if he understood the weight of the moment, as if the promise etched in their father's final words was no longer a riddle. "You won't need eyes to see the truth. Trust Atlas." Now, guided by memory, by instinct, and by the loyalty of a dog who had belonged first to their father and now wholly to them, Ethan and Eli stepped deeper into the labyrinth. They did not fear the darkness. They had been born into it. What they feared was the shape of the truth waiting at the end of the trail, and the shadow of the man called Spectre. The coordinates from the Braille map led Ethan, Eli, and Maya across miles of desert roads to a farm long since abandoned. Its fences sagged, its barn leaned like a dying sentinel, and the silence carried the weight of something unnatural. Atlas stiffened the moment his paws touched the dirt. His growl was low, guttural, a warning. Then shadows moved. Figures in tactical gear broke from cover, rifles raised, boots pounding against the cracked earth. Ethan heard the metallic snap of a safety released. Eli caught the rhythm of footsteps closing fast. Before fear could root them in place, Atlas exploded forward. The old shepherd was a blur of fury, slamming into the first man with a snarl that ripped through the night. Gunfire cracked. The twins dropped to the ground, hearts hammering. They couldn't see the muzzle flashes, but they felt the air shatter around them. Instinct and training pressed into memory by their father guided them. Low, steady, always moving. Ethan swung his cane like a weapon, striking the knee of a man who had come too close, while Eli scrambled toward the sound of a fallen rifle and kicked it out of reach. Atlas's roar filled the chaos, and Maya's voice cut sharp through the noise. She had snatched a device from one of the attackers, her fingers flying across its surface. "Give me a second, just a second," she shouted. The screen cracked with static, then cleared. An audio file began to play. The voice that spilled into the night silenced everything. Steady, clipped, commanding, Colonel Gabriel Navarro. "Spectre betrayed us. He commanded my unit once. Trust no one but Atlas." Eli's throat tightened. Ethan's fists trembled. In that instant, the farm was no longer just an ambush site. It was proof their father had died chasing a traitor who had once stood at his side. Atlas returned to their feet, chest heaving, his coat streaked with dust. The boys reached for him together, steadying themselves against his strength. In the echo of their father's words, the truth was no longer a distant puzzle. It was a wound, fresh and undeniable. The abandoned rail depot rose from the desert like the skeleton of a forgotten beast, its roof half collapsed, its iron beams groaning in the night wind. Ethan and Eli stood with their hands on Atlas's collar, feeling the steady thrum of the dog's breath. Beside them, Maya checked her transmitter one last time, her voice a whisper but edged with steel. "This is it. We draw him out here or we lose the trail forever." The fake hard drive sat inside a steel briefcase, its blinking light a promise and a lie. To the twins, the case was nothing but weight in their hands, yet it felt heavier than anything they had ever carried. Their father's journal had warned them, Spectre will come for what he cannot bury. Tonight, they would find out if Gabriel Navarro's final gamble would pay off. The sound of engines shattered the silence. Vehicles screeched to a stop outside the depot. Doors slammed, boots pounded gravel. Atlas stiffened, ears sharp, a low growl vibrating through his chest. The twins held their ground. Spectre entered with the calm of a man who had killed too many times to fear consequence. His voice carried through the cavernous space, cold and unflinching. "Hand it over." Around him, armed men fanned out, rifles glinting under the floodlights that suddenly blazed to life. Ethan gripped the case tighter, his palms slick with sweat. Eli could hear the sharp intake of breath from the soldiers as they raised their weapons. For a suspended moment, it felt like the whole world balanced on the edge of a trigger. Then came the hiss. A tranquilizer dart cut through the air. Atlas yelped, the sound ripping through the twins like a blade. They dropped to their knees as the shepherd staggered, his body collapsing heavy against the ground. Ethan reached for him blindly, his hand finding the rise and fall of Atlas's chest, shallow but alive. Something inside both boys fractured. Atlas had been their father's final command, their compass, their strength. Seeing him fall felt like losing their father all over again. Spectre stepped closer, his tone dripping with contempt. "The dog lives, for now. Give me the drive." Ethan rose, shaking, clutching the briefcase. But before he could move, a different sound filled the depot. From above, Maya's voice burst through hidden speakers, sharp and undeniable. "Spectre betrayed us. He commanded my unit once. Trust no one but Atlas." Their father's words, played for the world. Spectre froze, his mask of control cracking for the first time. The floodlights flickered as federal strike teams stormed through side entrances. Stun grenades detonated in blinding flashes, their concussive booms rattling the walls. Soldiers shouted, gunfire roared, chaos consumed the depot. Ethan and Eli dropped flat, covering Atlas's body as shrapnel and smoke filled the air. Through the confusion, Eli caught a sound he would never forget. The retreating steps of Spectre, boots pounding, each stride carrying him deeper into the storm of dust and gunfire. For one heartbeat, a beam of light cut across the depot, illuminating his face. Ethan could not see it, but he felt it in his brother's sharp gasp. "It's him," Eli whispered, voice breaking. "I know his voice, his steps. It's him." In that instant, the blind brothers saw Spectre more clearly than anyone else ever could. Not with their eyes, but with the truth burned into their souls. By the time the smoke thinned, Spectre was gone. But his escape no longer mattered. His name, his betrayal, his crimes, everything had been broadcast, recorded, and sealed in evidence. The world now knew what their father had died to uncover. Ethan laid a trembling hand on Atlas's flank. The dog stirred, groggy but alive, a steady pulse beneath his fur. Relief flooded through the twins, hot and stinging like tears they couldn't stop. For the first time since the explosion that had taken their father, Ethan and Eli felt the war shifting. They had not ended it, not yet, but they had brought the truth into the light. And sometimes that was enough to begin. Justice, when it finally came, did not roar. It unfolded like a tide swallowing everything Spectre had built. With the files from Outpost 7 and the recording broadcast inside the depot, the Helios Syndicate crumbled. Names that had once moved freely in the shadows now appeared in headlines. Bank accounts froze, secret contracts collapsed, and officials who had hidden behind power suddenly found their doors kicked down by federal agents. The silence that had once suffocated Ethan and Eli's family was gone. The truth had been dragged into daylight, and it left nowhere for corruption to hide. But for the twins, victory was not measured in arrests or frozen assets. It was measured in the steady heartbeat beneath Atlas's fur, in the way the old shepherd stirred and pressed his weight against their legs as if he had never left. His recovery was slow, every step careful, but when Atlas lifted his head and nudged Ethan's hand, it felt like their father's voice had come back to them, steady and commanding as ever. "Trust Atlas." The world saw headlines. The brothers felt healing. In the weeks that followed, the gas station transformed. Where once there had been rust and silence, there was now hammering, sweeping, the scrape of paintbrushes across wood. Ethan and Eli learned every nail, every board by touch, building a map of the station in their minds as they restored it, piece by piece. Maya stayed, her hands pulling wires and circuits into new life, her voice guiding the boys as if she had always been part of their family. Atlas watched it all, padding between rooms like a foreman, his paws tracking dust and his eyes carrying more certainty than sight ever could. When the pumps stood tall again, when the roof no longer sagged, the place was no longer Navarro Fuel and Service. It was something new. They called it Haven of Light. The name was more than a tribute. It was a promise. Haven of Light became a refuge for those who carried battles within themselves. Veterans scarred by wars nobody else could see, men and women who fought silent wars long after uniforms were folded away. Here, they found shelter, food, and something more powerful than either: dogs trained to be companions, guides, guardians. Service animals who would stand where people could not, just as Atlas had stood for Ethan and Eli. On the day of the dedication, the desert horizon burned with gold. A small crowd gathered, veterans with weary shoulders, families who understood loss too deeply, strangers drawn by word of mouth. The old sign had been replaced with a new wooden plaque, carved deep with braille. Ethan's fingers traced each raised dot, every groove, memorizing the message, not just in touch but in heart. "Our father's legacy wasn't darkness," Ethan whispered, voice trembling but certain. "It was the light that helps us go on." Eli placed his hand over his brother's, completing the sentence in silence. Beside them, Atlas leaned into their legs, steady, unyielding. The old shepherd didn't need words. His presence was the language of faith fulfilled. For the first time since the night of the explosion, the twins felt no hollow ache, no unfinished question pressing down on their hearts. Their father had not left them abandoned. He had left them a path, a purpose, and the one guardian who had never wavered. The depot, the farm, the ambushes, all of it had been part of a storm. But here in the quiet desert evening, peace finally bloomed. Haven of Light was more than a building. It was a beacon. And as laughter and conversation filled the once empty station, Ethan and Eli stood in the glow of a legacy reborn, not in shadows, not in grief, but in light.